What we're going to talk about this time is the fall of Rome. This is sometimes known as late antiquity, and the fall of Rome leads directly to what everyone likes to call the Dark Ages, and I'm sure you've heard this phrase before, and it's a badly inaccurate name. So when Rome, quote unquote, falls, the idea is that the light of Western civilization goes out, and this is kind of a ridiculous view. It's definitely a Rome-centric view because you should ask yourself several questions. Number one, did people disappear? Did culture disappear? Um, no, certainly not. In fact, Christianity becomes a world force in this time, and um, you really only get that as a byproduct of these other horrible things happening in terms of the collapse of Rome. So, I mean, you could even argue, does Rome even collapse, or does it just kind of slowly evolve into something else? And the collapse of Rome is one of the most complicated, most studied eras from the ancient world. And men have made, well, I should say historians, not men, but they've made their entire careers just writing about and studying this specific question of the collapse of Rome. And the problem with, I mean, you can't even attach a very specific year to the collapse of Rome. So it it greatly depends upon your worldview or what you're arguing, um, how you even locate the collapse of Rome in time. There are some things that we can say about the collapse, and and you can definitely see a beginning and an after. So Rome is kind of the victim of its own success. They have problems with administration, the exact same as Alexander. And there's issues with food shortages, border security, the military, basic communication over thousands of miles. And to respond to this, the Emperor Diocletian breaks the empire roughly in half and installs a kind of a co-emperor. In the very beginning, this was Maximian. And with the split, they dramatically increased the Roman civil service. And the byproduct of increasing the Roman civil service, basically people that work for the government itself, is that you also increase Roman authority down at the local level. And people do not like that. We do not like that to this very day. Um, when the government increases its authority at the local level, a lot of times you'll get the uh, people complaining that the government is meddling, et cetera, et cetera. So whenever you get the increase at the local level, you see a corresponding kind of feedback loop of people being unhappy. Now, an example of how this plays out at the local level is, let's say, 302 AD and the Edict of Maximum Prices. And what happens is there's a huge census of the Roman population, and Rome attempts to stop inflation in the empire by setting prices by law. That means that if you have a product that you're selling, you can only charge what you are allowed to charge based upon what Rome itself has decided. And obviously, people consider this tinkering and intrusion. And if you think about it, um, this kind of begins to people begin to see this as sort of an erosion of Roman authority, actually, because people are no longer in line with Roman authority if they're seeing this kind of meddling down at the smallest micromanagement level. Diocletian sets up a tetrarchy, and this is where there are four rulers in the empire. And it doesn't work very well. Almost immediately, the members turn on each other. Um, Other Romans seize control and kill each other. And you can see this kind of in this graphic here. One is killed by the next one, is killed by the next one, is killed by the next one, is killed by the next one. And this is not a successful way to have governance. But in this system, Rome kind of limps and lurches along until Constantine the First, Constantine the Great, kills Licinius. And once he kills Licinius, he becomes the only emperor again. And this is after years of disorganization and outright. Diocletian sets conditions that will allow the empire to weaken. So Constantine comes along and saves the empire from kind of snuffing itself out, founds what would become the Byzantine Empire, and creates a reservoir of Roman knowledge, law, and culture. And the most significant result of all this is the rise in the importance of Christianity. And of course, that has significant ramifications for Western civilization at large. So remember back to that chart that you saw just a couple of slides ago. Constantine meets um, Maxentius at a place called Milvian Bridge. And as he's preparing for battle, he has this vision and he kind of sees in the sky or hears the voice of God, but he perceives these Greek letters, the chi and rho. And this is the symbol used by Christians, early Christians. And this vision tells him to go in this sign and conquer, literally in Latin, in hoc signo vinces. And all of the soldiers are ordered to paint this chiro, this symbol, on their shields, uniforms, their standards, etc. And they go on to absolutely crush Maxentius's army and kill Maxentius himself. And the victory here, the shattering defeat of his rival, has a profound impact on Constantine's thinking. Within 1 year, Constantine issues the Edict of Milan, and that edict legalizes Christianity in the empire. So Christianity is no longer an underground religion. It can be practiced openly. And more importantly, Christianity receives state support. And this means that Rome builds churches and major religious structures all over. They begin the construction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, and that is probably one of the most important buildings in all of Christendom. They begin to build the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. There's just an explosive growth of Christianity. And by 325, the Council of Nicaea meets, and their entire purpose is to decide ideas of doctrine. So there are many different versions of Christianity up until this point. One of them is espoused by a man named Arius, and his problem is trying to reconcile the idea of Christ um, and God as separate but equal aspects of God. And Arius reduces Christ in proportion to God himself, meaning that in the grand story of everything, um, Christ is not an equal um, partner in the Trinity. So for Catholics, this is a huge heresy. And this Council of Nicaea stops a lot of this. It really begins to lock down the actual doctrine of Christianity as to what the official story is and who the official representatives are and um, who can be coming up with um, the specific details. So really, there's a split between Arius and the rest of the church. In 325, the Council of Nicaea decides all of these issues, and in 381, the Edict of Thessalonica, Thessalonica, you get the idea of Catholic as a specific type of Christian, and Catholicism becomes named the official version. And because it is the official version, all other versions of Christianity are dangerous. And not only dangerous, but quasi-satanic. They're evil almost. So in this painting on the right-hand side there, you can see quite literally Arius, who has this different vision of Christianity, is quite literally beneath Constantine and all of the other Catholics. He's kind of in this little hole underneath their feet. And it is also during this time period in the mid 300s that the office of the Pope is created. Pope Leo I is the one that makes the authority of the Pope overarching, and he also set the idea of the Pope being in Rome. And he explicitly, therefore, elevates Roman Catholicism above the Orthodox Archbishop in Constantinople. And in as far as the religious hierarchy goes, basically, the Catholics this time period are arguing that it goes from God to the Pope, from the Pope to the rest of the world. There is a huge invasion from the east in this time period, forces refugees into an already weakened and kind of softened up Roman Empire. You have to remember they're suffering all kind of food shortages. There's all manner of civil war. And in 376, Visigoths flee from the Huns that are attacking in Asia. And the Huns are out for, it's almost genocidal conquest, just wiping out whole towns and cities as they advance. And the Goths, the Visigoths, are basically running for their lives. This is really important because when the Visigoths enter the Roman Empire, it is not an invasion. It is not an invasion in the sense like Persia or Macedonia, where they're coming along and they're going to redo all the administration and overhaul all of these cultural practices. The Goths simply want a place to live. They're not looking for conquest. And the Goths are a group of tribes. There are multiple tribes we're talking about, and they all speak kind of Germanic dialects. And initially, they're allowed to settle out at the frontiers of the empire. This works out really well for Rome because Rome is using them as a buffer between Rome itself and these really terrifying, horrible things out there in the rest of the world, like the Huns, Attila the Hun. The problem is they're not treated fairly by any of the provincial Roman authorities. And the Romans start doing really horrible and disgusting things like selling dog meat to starving refugees in exchange not for money but for their children, which they then would sell into slavery. And obviously, this can't go on for very long before it leads to open revolt on the side of the Goths against the Romans. Open revolt and, of course, armed conflict. And in 378, Emperor Valens leads a Roman army into battle against the Visigoths at a place called Adrianople. And Valens is killed in combat. Now, more importantly, this entire Roman army is destroyed. And not just destroyed, but destroyed on the battlefield. This is the kind of thing that Rome has not suffered um, literally since the wars with Carthage. And everyone is completely stunned. The emperor's been killed. The Roman army has just been annihilated. And it's clear that Roman power, clear to everyone, that Roman power is simply not what it used to be. Now, Rome manages to hold on for quite a while after this, but it fails to offer the Visigoths any of their own states within the empire, although the Visigoths and the Romans do briefly become allies. Now, think about what we just talked about. Here's a really good moment where you can point to this and say, well, if the Romans can't uh, defeat this group on the battlefield and they're just wiped out and annihilated so horribly, maybe this is a good place to point to and say this must be where the collapse of the Roman Empire happens. But really, there's more to the story. The Visigoths again rise up against unfair practices. They never got a treaty with Rome after the death of Valens. And in 410, they march into Italy, and a Visigothic army under King Alaric I attacks and completely overwhelms Rome, the city of Rome. Now, this is the first time in 800 years that Rome itself has fallen to an outside enemy. And a lot of people will cite this as a traditional date for the fall of the Roman Empire. And this is one of those dates that you absolutely have to know. 410, the sack of the the sack of the city of Rome by the Visigoths. Now, even though people will point to 410 as the quote unquote fall of the Roman Empire, it's still much more complicated than this. Alaric is not out to conquer or overthrow Rome. The only thing he wants, and all of the rest of the Goths want, are to become participants. They want to become citizens of the Roman Empire. And in 418, Rome finally signs a treaty with the Visigoths. They settle in southern Gaul. Gaul would be what we would call France today. And they become the first of just many Germanic kingdoms inside the Roman Empire. Attila the Hun also returns, and he's bent on conquering everything in Europe. He is stopped at the Battle of Chalon by a combined army of Goths and Romans. And the Gothic commander dies on the field, and I think it's pretty clear at this point that the Goths are interested more in defending their new home. Um, Tons of Goths are absorbed into the Roman army, and the cultural distinctions between these kind of Roman uh, soldiers and these barbarian Goths are beginning to blur. So you have them in such close proximity and sharing similar administrative apparatus that it's beginning to become more and more difficult to distinguish who is actually Roman and who is from outside. The following year, Attila the Hun attempts to attack the city of Rome with his army, and he's met outside the city by Pope Leo the First. And somehow the Pope convinces Attila to turn back. This, of course, saves Rome from the fate of many other cities where they're just completely burned to the ground. Everybody inside is slaughtered. Attila turning back very likely had much to do with the fact that Attila's army was carrying plague, and even though he had a strong force, he would have had a tremendous time actually finishing the conquest. But the fact that Attila the Hun turns back for whatever reason is a tremendous propaganda victory for the church. And this is a huge boost to the power of the Pope and, of course, Christianity in general. So when I show you a slide like this, don't panic. Um, Looking at this, I want to emphasize the political and military chaos that's going on at this time. And this is all prior to the sack of Rome. In 418, or excuse me, 410 AD, there's a rolling group of military generals that attempt to hold power. And this is outright civil war. And there's just tremendous bloodshed. Rome is quite literally bleeding itself dry. And this creates all of the conditions that you need for social collapse. And the best example that I can give you of this is what happens in Britain. Now, Britain, of course, has been a Roman province since Claudius went down there with no nonsense troops and took over the place. Now, because of all this chaos, because of the ongoing social problems, the troops that are garrisoned in Britain do not get paid and they revolt. And they name their own emperor. But that kind of system where you have that kind of mutiny amongst your troops tends to feed on itself. And they have trouble um, finding someone that they like, if you will. And they're also under attack by locals. There's ongoing attacks from the Saxons. There's ongoing attacks from the Celts and the Picts that are still out there and they still want the Romans out of Britain. And they essentially put down attack after attack after attack, but then they're given the order to evacuate Britain by Emperor Honorius. This is also, or that, excuse me, that order is given in 410 BC. And Roman towns and villages in Britain are essentially told you are now on your own. Defend yourself. You cannot expect troops to protect you. And then these soldiers are called back to Rome because look at the date, 410 BC. We all know that's when Alaric sacks Rome anyway. But think of the mess that is being created by this just complete upheaval in the military, complete upheaval in society. Speaking specifically of Britain, the evacuation of the Romans, excuse me, of the Roman army creates a power vacuum, and it is immediately filled by um, Angles, Jutes, and Saxons. And these groups are from what would be today modern day northern Germany. And they established Germanic kingdoms on the ruins of Roman Britain. And these kingdoms, or excuse me, these groups, kind of universally called Saxons. There's different tribes, but they're all essentially Germanic-speaking folks. These Saxons drive the Celts and the Picts to the north. They drive the Scots into the west, and by the 9th century, the Saxons have created several of their own kingdoms in Britain, and they've wiped out all of um, the Roman influence is still there, but they've wiped out all the Roman administration and set up their own kingdoms. And the most important of these, and these are names you will hear again, are Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, and Northumbria. And it's not just in Britain where this process is taking place. A Christian king, Clovis I, begins to consolidate all of the Frankish tribes under his authority in central Gaul. That's, again, France, or what would be France today. He establishes the Merovingian dynasty, which will become a major power in their own right. But there's a sprinkling of these Germanic kingdoms all over the former Roman Empire, or at least the western part anyway. And you've got Visigoths, which would be located in modern, what would be modern day Spain, Ostrogoths in Italy, Vandals in North Africa, Saxons all over Britain, and you have Lombards and Burgundians that are smaller tribes, but they're still kind of in between these other larger Germanic tribes. What really causes the big problem is the arrival of the Vandals. And the Vandals are Arians. They believe in the teachings of Arius that we've already spoken about. And so, as far as the Catholics are concerned, these Vandals are absolute heretics. Now, the Vandals do manage to sack Rome in 455. By this point, there's absolutely no question that the power of Rome is eroded to the point where they are no longer the only authority that you wouldn't dare to attack in this part of the world. But the Ostrogoths get with the Eastern Empire and destroy the Vandals in 493. This is seen as God's work again because the Vandals are heretics. Now, the Ostrogoths ally with Eastern Rome to become the most dominant power in the West. So now you have a situation where you have a strong Eastern Empire that identifies itself as Roman, but the Ostrogoths, which are a Gothic tribe, are now the power players in the West. That would be what was formerly the Western Roman Empire. Someone kills the daughter of the Eastern Roman Emperor, and in retaliation, the Eastern Roman Empire attacks the Ostrogoths, and they destroy them, and in turn, the Ostrogoths are absorbed by the Lombards. Now, the most important thing to remember here is not all of these distinctions in between who killed who and all of this other. The most important thing to remember is that during these wars, the Western Roman Empire simply ceases to exist. Now, the irony is that all of these Germanic Goths do not consider themselves Goths. They think of themselves as and self-identify as Romans. So the distinction also between Goth, barbarian, and Roman has completely ceased to exist. So again, ask yourself this other question. If even if someone has moved in and they identify as Romans, has the Roman Empire fallen, or has it just evolved into something different, something new? These kind of Germanic speaking people that look like Romans, they dress like Romans, they talk like Romans, they, is it an evolution or is it a total collapse and destruction? The Eastern Roman Empire is a different story. It continues to hold on and prospers until 1453, excuse me, when it is completely overrun by Muslims and destroyed. Two very important figures in the Eastern Roman Empire you need to know about: Theodosius II. He actually has the longest reign of any Roman emperor ever, and in 438 completely reworks the Roman legal code. This is significant because this code is adopted by all of the Germanic kingdoms. Um, these Germanic kingdoms do consider themselves Roman after all. And eventually, Theodosius is followed by Justinian. Justinian reworks the legal code one more time, and he produces a very important document called the Corpus Juris Civilis. And this document condenses thousands of years of Roman legal theory into one document. And the Corpus Civilis directly influences every single legal system in existence on this planet today. Justinian also decides he wants to resurrect the glory of the Roman Empire. He embarks on a program of make Rome great again, to coin a phrase. And he orders the construction of the Hagia Sophia in 538. This would become the largest, most magnificent building on the planet at this time. And it's a church. It's important to construction. Um, it, it is so important a construction because it becomes a symbol of cultural magnificence. So much so that in 1453, during the Muslim conquest, it is converted from a Christian church into a mosque because it is a symbol of culture and power, etc. Incidentally, you can see lots of really good shots of the interior of this building, and exterior shots for that matter. If you watch the James Bond movie, it was 1963, From Russia with Love. And this building to this day, the Hagia Sophia, is the most visited cultural historical site in Turkey. Now, the fall of Rome, the division of the empire, has the most profound impact on Christianity. Catholicism grows in the West, consolidating its power. In the East, Christianity grows in kind of a power vacuum. And that power vacuum is filled by what becomes known as Orthodox Christianity or Greek Orthodox. And now these are all Christians. They all self-identify as Christians with essentially the same types of belief in uh, God and salvation and all of this, basically. But there are a couple of major differences. One, and the obvious one, being location. The Catholics are centered in the city of Rome itself, and the Greek Orthodox is centered in Constantinople. There's a language difference. Roman Catholics use Latin for the services and disseminating the documents, and the Greek Orthodox, as suggested by the name, uses Greek. There's a difference in the leaders, not necessarily that they have leaders, but in the relationship of the leader to the religious hierarchy. So the Pope in Rome is seen at this time is seen as an infallible figure. Like I said before, it goes from God to the Pope to the rest of the world. And conversely, for the Greek Orthodox, the Archbishop is not seen as an infallible link in the chain, as it were, but as just a kind of servant in a greater hierarchy. It is impossible to overstate the importance that the rise of Christianity has for Western civilization. Please do not misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm not suggesting that this is the one true religion and everyone should run out and convert. What I'm saying is you cannot look at the cultural and historical products of Western civilization without coming to grips with the fact of the power of Christianity for whatever reason. You cannot understand the works of Shakespeare without having a basic grasp of Christianity. And so much education legal structures and everything else flow from this, um, political structures as well, that you have to know something about it in order to understand the